sometimes evil hides behind a smile.
Sometimes a monster wears a wedding ring and calls himself a husband. Sometimes the worst predators are the ones who think no one is watching.
But what happens when the watchers are Navy SEALs who've seen real evil and know exactly how to handle it?
In a world where domestic violence often happens behind closed doors, where victims suffer in silence, and where abusers believe they're untouchable, this is the story of what happens when a coward's cruelty meets warriors who've sworn to protect the innocent. This is the story of how laughter turned to terror, how a bully met his match, and how sometimes justice comes not from a courtroom, but from men who understand that some lines should never be crossed.
What you're about to read isn't just a story about revenge. It's a story about honor, brotherhood, and what happens when evil finally meets its match. It's about the moment when a wife-beater's world came crashing down, not because of the law, not because of divorce papers, but because he made one fatal mistake. He thought no one cared enough to stop him. He was wrong.
Sarah Martinez had learned to read the signs. The way Marcus's jaw tightened when he walked through the front door. The particular rhythm of his footsteps on the hardwood floor. The silence that followed when he tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter with just a little too much force. After 6 years of marriage, she could predict his moods like a meteorologist reading storm clouds. Tonight, all the signs pointed to thunder. She stood at the kitchen sink, washing the dinner dishes with careful, quiet movements.
Every clink of ceramic against ceramic made her wince.
Marcus sat in his recliner in the living room, beer in hand, watching some action movie with the volume turned up loud enough to rattle the windows. The neighbors in their Virginia Beach apartment complex had complained before, but Marcus didn't care about the neighbors. He didn't care about much of anything except his own comfort and control.
Sarah dried the last plate and placed it gently in the cabinet.
She moved through the kitchen like a ghost, turning off lights and wiping down counters with practiced silence. Maybe if she could just finish her evening routine without drawing attention to herself, maybe if she could slip into bed before he noticed her, maybe tonight would be different. But, as she turned to leave the kitchen, Marcus's voice cut through the movie's dialogue like a blade.
"Sarah! Get in here!" Her stomach dropped. She knew that tone.
It was the tone that meant she'd done something wrong, even if she couldn't figure out what. It was the tone that meant the evening was about to get much worse. She walked into the living room, her bare feet silent on the carpet.
Marcus didn't look away from the television. On screen, some action hero was beating up bad guys while dramatic music swelled. The irony wasn't lost on her.
"You didn't take out the trash," Marcus said, his voice deceptively calm.
Sarah's mind raced.
She had taken out the trash.
She remembered doing it that morning, right after breakfast.
She'd tied up the bag, carried it out to the dumpster behind their building, and put a fresh liner in the can.
She was certain of it.
"I did take it out," she said quietly.
"This morning, before you left for work."
Now Marcus turned to look at her, and she saw the familiar cold glint in his eyes. He was a handsome man, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair and a smile that had once made her heart skip. But she'd learned to fear that smile.
It never meant anything good.
"Are you calling me a liar?" he asked, setting his beer down with deliberate slowness. "No, because I just went to throw away my bottle, and the can is full."
"Overflowing, actually."
"So either you're lying about taking it out, or you're too stupid to do it right." Sarah felt the familiar knot forming in her stomach. She wanted to explain that he'd probably filled the can back up during the day, that she'd done exactly what she was supposed to do. But she'd learned that explanations only made him angrier. "I'll take it out now," she said instead.
"It's too late now. The damage is done."
Marcus stood up, all 6 feet 2 inches of him unfolding from the chair like a predator rising to hunt.
"Do you know how embarrassing it is for me to come home to a house that's not properly maintained? What kind of wife can't even handle basic household chores?"
"Marcus, please what?" He stepped closer, and Sarah instinctively backed up until her shoulders hit the wall.
"Please excuse your incompetence? Please pretend that I don't work 10 hours a day to keep a roof over your head while you can't even manage to keep the house clean?" The accusations weren't true, and they both knew it.
Sarah worked part-time at a local veterinary clinic, and she maintained their apartment meticulously. But truth had never been the point of these conversations. The point was control. The point was making her feel small and worthless and dependent on his approval. "I work too," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The change in Marcus's expression was immediate and terrifying. His face went from cold anger to volcanic rage in the span of a heartbeat. Before Sarah could react, before she could duck or cover her face or run, his hand shot out and connected with her cheek in a sharp, stinging slap that made her ears ring. "Don't you dare talk back to me," he snarled, his face inches from hers. "Your little part-time job playing with puppies doesn't count as work. I'm the man in this house. I'm the one who provides. And you will show me the respect I deserve." Sarah's cheek burned, but she didn't cry. She'd learned not to cry. Tears only made him angrier, made him hit harder. Instead, she stared at a spot on the wall behind his shoulder and waited for it to be over. But Marcus wasn't done. He never was after just one hit. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he demanded, grabbing her chin and forcing her to meet his eyes. "You think you can just ignore me? You think you can disrespect me in my own home?" His grip on her chin tightened until she was certain he'd leave bruises. She'd gotten good at covering bruises with makeup, good at explaining away injuries at work. But the finger-shaped marks on her jaw would be harder to hide. "I'm sorry," she whispered, hating herself for apologizing, hating herself for being too afraid to fight back. "You're sorry?" Marcus laughed, and the sound was worse than his anger. It was cold and cruel and completely without humor. "You're sorry for being a useless wife? You're sorry for embarrassing me? You're sorry for making me come home to this disaster?" Each question was punctuated by a shake that made her teeth rattle. Sarah could smell the beer on his breath, could see the twisted satisfaction in his eyes. He enjoyed this. That was the part that scared her most of all. He genuinely enjoyed making her suffer. "Yes," she managed to say. "I'm sorry." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, his fingers still digging into her chin. Then, without warning, he shoved her away from him. Sarah stumbled, catching herself against the wall, her hand automatically going to her bruised face. "Clean up this mess," Marcus said, gesturing vaguely at the living room that was already spotless. "And, next time, maybe you'll remember to do your job right the first time." He settled back into his recliner and turned his attention back to the television, dismissing her as if she were nothing more than an irritating insect. Sarah stood there for a moment, touching her swollen cheek, feeling the familiar mixture of shame, fear, and helpless rage that followed every one of these encounters. This was her life. This was what she'd chosen when she'd said "I do" 6 years ago. This was what she'd signed up for when she'd believed his promises that he would love and protect her. She'd traded her freedom, her dignity, and her safety for the security of marriage, and this was what she'd gotten in return. But, even in her darkest moments, Sarah couldn't have imagined that everything was about to change. She couldn't have known that just 2 floors down, in apartment 2B, a group of men were sitting around a poker table, and they'd heard every word of Marcus's abuse. She couldn't have known that these particular neighbors weren't the type to mind their own business when someone was hurting an innocent woman. And she definitely couldn't have known that Marcus had just made the worst mistake of his life by choosing to abuse his wife in an apartment building where 4 active-duty Navy SEALs happened to live right below them. The men in apartment 2B weren't ordinary neighbors. They were warriors who'd sworn an oath to protect the innocent, and they just witnessed something that violated everything they believed in. They'd heard Sarah's quiet apologies and Marcus's cruel laughter, and they were already making plans. Because if there was one thing that Delta Team knew how to do, it was how to handle bullies. And Marcus Martinez was about to learn that some people fight back harder than a scared wife alone in her kitchen. The game was about to change, and Marcus had no idea that he'd just painted a target on his own back. The SEALs downstairs were done listening to his abuse, and they were about to show him what real fear looked like. But, for now, Sarah dried her tears, touched her bruised face one more time, and began to clean a living room that was already clean, just like she did every night. She had no way of knowing that this would be the last time she'd ever have to do that again.
Tomorrow, everything would be different. Tomorrow, Marcus would learn that he wasn't as untouchable as he thought. Tomorrow, the laughter would stop, and the real education would begin. But tonight, Sarah cleaned in silence while her husband laughed at the violence on his television screen, completely unaware that the real violence was about to come knocking on his door. 2 floors below the Martinez apartment, the poker game had gone completely silent. 4 men sat around a folding table in apartment 2B, cards forgotten in their hands, listening to the sounds coming from upstairs with expressions that would have made hardened terrorists think twice. Chief Petty Officer Jake Razor Rodriguez set down his cards with the careful precision of a man controlling serious anger. At 32, he'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, leading Delta Team through operations that would never make it into any official reports. He'd seen the worst that humanity had to offer, but something about hearing a woman being abused in the safety of her own home hit him in a way that combat never had. "That's the 3rd time this month," said Petty Officer First Class Tommy Ghost Chan, his voice barely above a whisper. Despite his nickname, there was nothing ghostly about Tommy's presence when he was angry. At 28, he was the team's communications specialist and their designated sniper, known for his ability to stay perfectly calm under pressure. But the vein pulsing in his temple suggested that his famous composure was being tested. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Bull Washington cracked his knuckles, a sound like small bones breaking. At 6 feet 4 inches and 250 pounds of pure muscle, Bull was the team's explosive specialist and their designated door kicker. He'd earned his nickname not just for his size, but for his tendency to charge through obstacles that other people would try to go around. Right now, those obstacles included the apartment upstairs and the man who lived in it. "I say we go up there and end this," Bull said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made enemy fighters surrender without a shot being fired. "Hold on," said the 4th man at the table, though his tone suggested he was having trouble taking his own advice. Petty Officer First Class David Phoenix Martinez, no relation to the Marcus upstairs, a fact that made him particularly angry about sharing a last name with an abuser, was the team's medic and their voice of reason. At 29, he'd seen more combat injuries than most doctors, and he'd saved lives that other people would have written off as lost causes. But right now, he was thinking less about saving lives and more about ending one. "We can't just kick down his door," Phoenix continued, though his hands were clenched into fists on the table. "Much as I'd love to, we need to be smart about this." "Smart about what?" Ghost asked. "The guy's upstairs beating his wife. We're Navy SEALs. This is literally what we signed up to do, protect innocent people from assholes who think they can hurt whoever they want." Razor nodded slowly. As the team leader, he'd made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for his men and countless civilians. But this situation required a different kind of planning. This wasn't a battlefield in some foreign country. This was Virginia Beach, and they were technically off-duty. "Ghost is right about our mission," Razor said carefully. "But we're also not vigilantes. We need to think about consequences." From upstairs, they heard Marcus's voice again, raised in anger, followed by the sound of something hitting the wall. The 4 men exchanged glances, and years of working together allowed them to communicate without words. They'd all heard that sound before, in villages and cities around the world. It was the sound of violence against the innocent. Consequences? Bull's voice was getting louder, and Ghost made a subtle hand gesture for him to keep it down. "The consequence of doing nothing is that woman gets beaten to death while we sit down here playing cards." "I'm not saying we do nothing," Razor replied. "I'm saying we do this right. We're not going to solve this problem by storming upstairs and beating the hell out of this guy, no matter how much he deserves it." "Why not?" Bull demanded. "It's what he deserves. It's what anyone who hits women deserves." Phoenix leaned forward, his medical training kicking in even through his anger. "Because if we assault him, we go to prison. And then, we're not helping anybody. We need to be smart about this." "So what do you suggest?" Ghost asked. "We call the cops? They'll show up, take a report, maybe arrest him if she presses charges, which she probably won't because she's scared. Then, they'll leave, and he'll beat her twice as hard for calling them. It was a depressingly accurate assessment, and they all knew it.
They'd all seen domestic violence cases during their time in the service, both overseas and at home. The system was designed to protect abusers as much as it protected victims, and women like Sarah often fell through the cracks.
What if we don't assault him?
Razor said slowly, the beginning of an idea forming in his mind.
What if we just talk to him?
Bull snorted.
Talk?
Jake, this guy just finished slapping around his wife.
You think he's going to respond to a nice conversation about treating women with respect?
No, Razor said, a smile beginning to form on his face.
It wasn't a nice smile.
It was the kind of smile that had made Taliban commanders decide to find somewhere else to be.
But I think he might respond to a different kind of conversation.
The other three men looked at him with interest. They'd all served under Razor's leadership long enough to recognize that look. It meant he had a plan, and his plans tended to be both effective and satisfying.
Explain, Phoenix said.
We don't assault him, Razor continued.
We don't threaten him, not directly.
We just make sure he understands the situation he's in. We make sure he knows that his behavior has been noticed. We make sure he understands that there are consequences for hurting innocent people, even if those consequences don't come from the legal system.
Psychological warfare, Ghost said, nodding approvingly. I like it. More than that, Razor said.
We make him understand that he's not anonymous anymore.
That he's not invisible.
That there are people watching him, people who know exactly what kind of man he is, and people who won't hesitate to act if he steps out of line again. From upstairs, they heard the sound of Sarah moving around, probably cleaning up whatever mess Marcus had made of their living room. The sound of quiet suffering, of a woman trying to make herself invisible in her own home. Bull's hands were still clenched into fists, but he nodded slowly.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
We make him scared without actually touching him.
Exactly, Razor said.
And we make sure Sarah knows that she's not alone anymore. That there are people in this building who care about what happens to her, people who won't stand by and watch her get hurt.
How do we do that without tipping our hand? Phoenix asked.
If we just knock on their door and introduce ourselves as concerned neighbors, he's going to know something's up.
Ghost smiled, and it was almost as unsettling as Razor's had been. Leave that to me. I've got an idea.
The four men spent the next hour planning, using the same tactical precision they applied to military operations.
They discussed timing, approach, contingencies, and extraction procedures.
They planned for every possible response Marcus might have, from compliance to aggression to calling the police himself. By the time they were finished, they had a comprehensive strategy that would accomplish several goals. It would make Marcus understand that his abuse was no longer private, it would demonstrate to Sarah that she had allies, and it would establish clear consequences for any future violence.
Remember, Razor said as they prepared to execute their plan, we're not vigilantes.
We're concerned neighbors who happen to have some unique skills. We're not threatening him, we're just making sure he understands the situation.
Right, Bull said dryly.
We're just having a friendly conversation about community standards and neighborhood watch programs.
Exactly, Razor replied, though his smile suggested that the conversation was going to be anything but friendly.
And if he happens to get the impression that continuing to abuse his wife would be a very bad idea, well, that's just good communication skills on our part. The apartment upstairs had gone quiet, suggesting that Marcus had either passed out drunk or moved on to other forms of abuse.
Either way, the SEALs knew they couldn't wait much longer.
Sarah needed to know that help was coming, and Marcus needed to understand that his reign of terror was about to end. They'd spent years protecting innocent people from monsters in foreign countries. Now they had a chance to protect an innocent woman from a monster right here at home. It was time to remind Marcus Martinez that there were still people in the world who believed in justice, even when the justice system failed.
Gentlemen, Razor said, standing up from the poker table, let's go introduce ourselves to our upstairs neighbor.
The other three men stood as well, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They'd gone from being off-duty sailors playing cards to being a tactical unit with a mission. And their mission was simple: make sure that Sarah Martinez never had to face her husband's violence alone again. Marcus had spent 6 years believing that he could hurt his wife without consequences. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. The SEALs were coming, and they were bringing justice with them. But, first, they were going to introduce themselves. And Marcus was going to learn what fear really felt like when it came from men who'd made a career out of being the scariest thing in the room. The game was about to change, and the new players didn't lose. Marcus Martinez was settling into his third beer and feeling quite satisfied with himself when the knock came at his door. It wasn't the timid tap of a nervous neighbor or the authoritative rap of law enforcement. It was something in between, polite but firm, the kind of knock that suggested the people on the other side weren't going away. "Sarah!" Marcus barked without moving from his recliner. "Get the door." But Sarah didn't respond. She'd retreated to the bedroom after cleaning up, probably crying into her pillow like she always did. The thought made Marcus smile. It was good for her to remember who was in charge. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Damn it," Marcus muttered, heaving himself out of his chair. He'd been looking forward to finishing his movie in peace, and now some idiot neighbor was interrupting his relaxation time. Probably Mrs. Henderson from next door complaining about the TV volume again. He'd tell her exactly what he thought about her complaints. Marcus yanked open the door, ready to unleash his irritation on whoever had the audacity to bother him this late in the evening. But the words died in his throat when he saw who was standing in his hallway. 4 men stood in the corridor, arranged in what looked like a casual formation but felt like something else entirely. They were all in their late 20s or early 30s, all in excellent physical condition, and all carrying themselves with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested they'd seen serious action. The one in front, a Hispanic man with sharp eyes and a deceptively calm expression, stepped forward slightly. "Marcus Martinez?" the man asked, his voice polite but somehow carrying an undertone that made Marcus's instincts scream danger. "Yeah, that's me. Who's asking?" Marcus tried to inject some authority into his voice, but it came out weaker than he'd intended. "I'm Jake Rodriguez," the man said, extending a hand. "We're your neighbors from downstairs. Apartment 2B. We thought we should introduce ourselves." Marcus shook the offered hand reflexively, immediately noticing the calluses and the grip strength that suggested these weren't office workers. Okay. Nice to meet you, I guess. These are my roommates," Jake continued, gesturing to the other 3 men. "Tommy Chen, Marcus Washington, and David Martinez. We're all stationed at Norfolk. Military." Marcus's blood ran cold, though he tried not to show it. He'd never served himself, always finding excuses to avoid the draft and, later the volunteer military. But he recognized the bearing, the way they stood, the careful way they watched him without seeming to. "Navy?" Marcus asked, trying to sound casual. "Special Operations," said the one introduced as Tommy, his voice carrying a slight accent. "We just got back from deployment." Marcus forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "Well, welcome back. Thanks for your service and all that." "Our pleasure," Jake said. "We love what we do. Protecting innocent people, stopping bad guys from hurting those who can't protect themselves. It's very fulfilling work." There was something in the way he said it that made Marcus uncomfortable, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. The words were perfectly normal, even patriotic, but they felt loaded with meaning that Marcus couldn't quite grasp. "That's great," Marcus said, starting to close the door. "Well, it was nice meeting you guys, but, actually," Jake said, placing his hand on the doorframe in a gesture that looked casual but effectively prevented Marcus from closing the door, "we were hoping to chat with you for a few minutes." Neighbor to neighbor. "It's kind of late," Marcus said, acutely aware that he was still holding a beer and probably smelled like alcohol. "Maybe some other time?" "Oh, this won't take long," said the one called Marcus Washington, who was built like a linebacker and had a smile that somehow managed to be both friendly and threatening. "We just wanted to discuss some building policies with you." "Building policies?" "Noise ordinances," Tommy explained helpfully. "Disturbing the peace."
That sort of thing. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Had they heard what happened earlier? Had they heard him disciplining Sarah? He glanced back toward the bedroom, but there was no sign of his wife. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, trying to inject some indignation into his voice. We're quiet neighbors. We mind our own business. Oh, we're sure you are, said David Martinez, the fourth man, who had been quiet until now. It's just that sometimes sounds carry in these old buildings. Thin walls, you know? Sounds. Marcus's mouth was getting dry. Voices, Jake explained. Sometimes raised voices. Sometimes sounds like, well, like someone might be having a hard time upstairs. Marcus's heart was pounding now, but he tried to maintain his composure. These guys were fishing. They didn't know anything for sure. They were just being nosy neighbors, and he could handle nosy neighbors. Look, I don't know what you think you heard, but, oh, we heard quite a bit, Tommy interrupted, his voice still perfectly polite but somehow much colder. We heard a man yelling at a woman. We heard what sounded like someone being hit. We heard a woman apologizing for things that didn't sound like her fault. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. They had heard. They knew. But that didn't mean they could do anything about it. This was his home, his wife, his business. I think you guys are mistaken, he said, trying to close the door again. And, even if you weren't, what happens in my home is my business. This time it was Bull who placed his hand on the door, and his grip was considerably stronger than Jake's had been. The door didn't budge. See, that's where we disagree, Bull said, his voice carrying a rumble like distant thunder. When someone hurts an innocent person, that becomes our business. It's what we do professionally. You can't threaten me, Marcus said, though his voice was shaking now. This is America. I have rights. Absolutely, Jake agreed. You have lots of rights. The right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, the right to a fair trial. All kinds of rights. But, here's the thing about rights, David added, stepping closer so that all four men were now crowding the doorway. They come with responsibilities. And, one of those responsibilities is not hurting people who can't fight back. Marcus backed up a step, his beer forgotten in his hand. These men were big, all of them, and they moved with the kind of coordination that suggested they'd worked together for a long time. More importantly, they looked at him like he was something they'd found on the bottom of their boots. You guys need to leave, Marcus said, his voice climbing higher. You're harassing me. I'll call the police. Please do, Tommy said, pulling out his cell phone and offering it to Marcus. I'd love to talk to the police about what we heard tonight. I'm sure they'd be very interested in our testimony. Marcus stared at the phone but didn't take it. Calling the police would mean questions, investigations, reports. It would mean Sarah might be forced to speak to officers, might be encouraged to press charges. It would mean his private business becoming very public very quickly. What do you want? Marcus asked, and immediately hated himself for how weak he sounded. We want to make sure we understand each other, Jake said. We want to make sure you understand that you're not anonymous anymore. That people are watching. That people care about what happens to your wife. She's my wife, Marcus said, trying to summon some authority. What happens between us is private. Not anymore, it's not, Bull said flatly. See, we've made it our business now. And, we're very good at our business. Are you threatening me? Marcus asked, though he was pretty sure he already knew the answer. Threatening you? Jake looked genuinely surprised. Of course not. We're just introducing ourselves. Being neighborly. Making sure you know that you have people living nearby who care deeply about the welfare of innocent people. Very deeply, David agreed. It's like a calling for us. A mission, Tommy added. A sacred duty, Bull finished. Marcus looked from one man to another, seeing the same expression in all their eyes. It wasn't anger, exactly, though that was certainly there. It wasn't hatred, though he suspected that might come later.
It was something much worse, it was professional interest. They were looking at him the way he imagined they looked at targets in whatever godforsaken countries they'd been sent to. "I get it," Marcus said, trying to sound reasonable. "You heard some noise, you got concerned, that's good of you. But there's nothing to worry about here. Sarah and we just had a little disagreement. It's normal couple stuff." "Normal couple stuff," Jake repeated slowly, as if tasting the words.
"Is that what you call hitting a woman who weighs 100 pounds less than you?"
We heard the slap," Tommy said quietly.
"We heard her apologize. We heard you laugh afterward." Marcus felt his knees go weak. They'd heard him laugh.
That was the part that would be hardest to explain away, the part that revealed how much he'd enjoy hurting Sarah.
"Look," Marcus tried again, "I think you guys are blowing this out of proportion. Sarah and we're fine. We work through our problems like any married couple." "By hitting her?" David asked.
"By establishing boundaries," Marcus said, immediately realizing how that sounded. The four SEALs exchanged glances, and Marcus saw something pass between them. Some kind of silent communication that he didn't understand, but that made his skin crawl. "Boundaries," Bull repeated, his voice carrying a note of disgust.
"That's an interesting word choice."
"Let us establish some boundaries for you," Jake said, stepping forward until he was close enough that Marcus could smell his aftershave.
"Boundary number 1, if we hear you raise your voice to your wife again, we're going to come back up here.
And we're going to have a much longer conversation. Boundary number 2, Tommy continued, if we hear any sounds that suggest you're hurting her, we're not going to knock politely. We're going to call the police, and we're going to make sure they have very detailed witness statements about what we observed."
Boundary number 3, David added, if your wife shows up to work with unexplained injuries, we're going to hear about it. We have friends everywhere, Marcus. The veteran community is smaller than you think.
And boundary number 4, Bull finished, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, if anything happens to Sarah, if she gets hurt worse than she already has been, if she disappears or has an accident or decides to leave town suddenly, we're going to hold you personally responsible. And we're going to respond accordingly.
Marcus's mouth was completely dry now.
These men weren't just making threats, they were laying out a comprehensive surveillance and response plan. They were treating him like an enemy combatant.
You can't do this, he whispered. You can't just threaten people. We're not threatening you, Jake said with a smile that was somehow worse than any threat could have been.
We're just making sure you understand the situation.
You're not invisible anymore, Marcus. You're not anonymous. You're not operating in the dark. We see you, Tommy said. We're watching, David added. We're ready, Bull concluded.
Marcus stood there in his doorway, holding his beer with a shaking hand, looking at four men who had just dismantled his entire world without raising their voices or laying a finger on him. They'd stripped away his anonymity, his sense of control, his feeling of safety in his own home.
Do we understand each other? Jake asked politely.
Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice to work.
Good, Jake said, stepping back. We're glad we could have this conversation. It's always good to know your neighbors. Sleep well, Tommy added with a smile. Sweet dreams, David said. We'll be right downstairs if you need anything, Bull finished.
And, with that, the four men turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing in his doorway with his mouth hanging open and his entire worldview shattered. He'd gone from feeling like the king of his castle to feeling like a prisoner in his own home in the space of a 10-minute conversation. He closed the door and leaned against it, his hands shaking as he tried to process what had just happened. For strangers had just walked up to his door and completely destroyed his sense of security without technically doing anything illegal. From the bedroom, he heard Sarah moving around, probably getting ready for bed. The thought of facing her right now, of looking at the bruises he'd put on her face while knowing that 4 trained killers were listening from downstairs, made him feel sick. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Martinez was truly afraid. And, the worst part was, he had a feeling this was only the beginning. The days that followed the SEAL's visit brought changes to the Martinez household that Sarah couldn't understand, but Marcus felt in his bones. For the first time in 6 years of marriage, Marcus was afraid to raise his voice. For the first time in 6 years, Sarah began to notice that her husband was looking over his shoulder.
It started small.
Marcus would pause at the window sometimes, looking down at the parking lot as if expecting to see someone watching their apartment. He would turn the TV volume down when he got angry, cutting off his own rants mid-sentence with glances toward the floor.
When Sarah dropped a plate and it shattered on the kitchen floor, Marcus started to yell, then stopped abruptly, his face going pale as he listened for sounds from the apartment below. Sarah cleaned up the broken ceramic in confused silence, waiting for the explosion that never came.
Instead, Marcus just walked away, leaving her to wonder what had changed in her husband's behavior. The answer came 3 days after the SEAL's visit, when Marcus came home from work looking like he'd seen a ghost.
"What's wrong?" Sarah asked, genuinely concerned despite everything.
6 years of marriage had created habits that were hard to break, and worry for his well-being was one of them.
"Nothing," Marcus snapped, then immediately modulated his tone when his own voice seemed to startle him. "Nothing's wrong. Just stay close to home for a while, okay?" "Why?"
Marcus looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, not anger, not contempt, but something that looked almost like fear.
"Just do what I say, Sarah. Please."
The please was what shocked her most.
Marcus never said please. He gave orders and expected obedience, but he never asked for it politely. What Sarah didn't know was that Marcus had spent his lunch break being followed. Not obviously, he wasn't even sure it was real until he tried to lose his tail by ducking into a restaurant and doubling back through the kitchen. The man following him had been waiting outside the back door with a patient smile and a knowing look. "Marcus Martinez?" the man had asked, though he'd clearly already known the answer. "Who's asking?" "Tommy Chen. We met the other night. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd say hi." It was a lie, and they both knew it.
Tommy had been following Marcus for 6 blocks, making sure he knew he was being watched. It was psychological warfare at its finest, no threats, no violence, just the constant reminder that Marcus was no longer invisible.
"What do you want?"
Marcus had asked, his voice barely steady.
"Nothing much.
Just wanted to make sure you remembered our conversation."
"Wanted to make sure you were taking good care of your wife. She's fine."
"I'm sure she is.
But, you know, Marcus, we have friends everywhere. The guy who works at the gas station where you buy your beer?
He served 2 tours in Iraq.
The woman who works at the grocery store where your wife shops? Her brother is a Marine. The security guard at your office building?
Former Special Forces." Tommy had smiled then, an expression that was friendly on the surface but carried darker currents underneath.
"The thing about the military community is that we look out for each other.
And we look out for people who need protection. Your wife has a lot of people looking out for her now, Marcus.
A lot of people who would be very upset if anything happened to her."
Marcus had tried to walk away, but Tommy had kept pace with him easily.
"Beautiful day, isn't it?" Tommy had continued conversationally.
"Perfect weather for a neighborhood barbecue.
We're thinking of having one this weekend."
Meeting all the neighbors, making sure everyone knows everyone.
Building community connections.
The message was clear, they were going to make themselves known to everyone in the building, everyone in the neighborhood.
They were going to make sure that Marcus's abuse could never again happen in anonymity.
"You can't do this," Marcus had said desperately. "You can't just harass me."
"Harass you?" Tommy had looked genuinely confused. "I'm just being friendly.
Just making conversation with a neighbor."
"Nothing wrong with that, is there?"
And that was the genius of their approach. Everything they did was technically legal, technically innocent. But the cumulative effect was devastating to Marcus's sense of control and security.
The psychological pressure continued over the following weeks.
Jake would be jogging when Marcus left for work in the morning, offering a cheerful wave and a smile that somehow managed to feel like a threat. Bull would be checking his mail when Marcus came home in the evening, nodding politely and asking how his day had been with eyes that seemed to see right through him. David was perhaps the most unsettling of all, because his approach was the most subtle. He would simply appear in places where Marcus was, the grocery store, the gas station, the DMV. Never approaching directly, never speaking, just being present.
A constant reminder that Marcus was being watched.
But the real change came in Marcus's own behavior. The knowledge that trained killers were listening to his every interaction with Sarah had completely neutered his capacity for violence. Every time he felt the familiar surge of anger, every time he wanted to lash out and establish dominance, he would hear Jake Rodriguez's voice in his head, "We'll be right downstairs if you need anything." Sarah began to notice the change immediately. Marcus still got angry, but now his anger seemed to dissipate as quickly as it formed. He would start to yell, then catch himself and lower his voice. He would raise his hand as if to strike her, then lower it and walk away instead. At first, Sarah was too confused to feel relief. This wasn't the man she'd married, not the charming man who'd swept her off her feet, but not the abuser she'd learned to fear either. This was someone else entirely, someone who seemed to be fighting an internal battle every time he looked at her. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the SEAL's initial visit. Marcus came home from work looking haggard and defeated, like a man who'd reached the end of his rope. Sarah was cooking dinner, moving carefully around the kitchen as she always did, trying to anticipate his mood and adjust accordingly. "Sarah," Marcus said quietly. She tensed, waiting for the criticism, the complaint, the excuse for violence. But, instead, Marcus sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. "I can't do this anymore," he said, so quietly that she almost didn't hear him. "Do what?" she asked, genuinely confused. Marcus looked up at her, and, for the first time in years, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't anger or contempt. It might have been fear, or exhaustion, or even regret. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely around the kitchen. "Us. The way I've been, the way I treat you." Sarah stood frozen, a wooden spoon halfway to her mouth for tasting. In 6 years of marriage, Marcus had never once acknowledged that his treatment of her was wrong. He'd never admitted fault, never shown remorse, never suggested that anything needed to change. "I don't understand," she said carefully. Marcus laughed, but it was a bitter, broken sound. "Some guys moved into the building. Military guys. Special operations." Sarah felt her heart skip. She'd heard voices in the hallway a few weeks ago, heard Marcus talking to someone at unusual length. But she'd learned not to ask questions about his interactions with other people. "They made it very clear that they've been listening to what happens up here," Marcus continued. "They made it very clear that they don't approve of the way I treat you." "What did they say?" "They didn't threaten me. Not directly. But they didn't have to." Marcus looked at her with something that might have been respect for the first time since their wedding day. "You've got some serious people looking out for you now, Sarah. People who know how to hurt someone without leaving evidence." Sarah felt a strange mixture of emotions flooding through her. Relief that someone had finally intervened. Gratitude toward men she'd never met. And something else, something that felt almost like hope. "Are you afraid of them?" she asked. Marcus nodded slowly. "Terrified. These aren't normal people, Sarah. These are men who kill terrorists for a living. And they've decided that I'm the terrorist in this situation." The word hung in the air between them. Terrorist. It was the first time Marcus had ever acknowledged that his behavior was anything more than normal marital discipline. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm going to get help. Real help. Because I'd rather face whatever demons are in my head than face those 4 men if I hurt you again." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a declaration of love or remorse. But it was acknowledgement, and it was the first step toward change. Marcus was finally admitting that his behavior was wrong, not because he'd had a moral awakening, but because he'd encountered people who were scarier than he was. From downstairs, they heard the sound of laughter, genuine, warm laughter from the Seals' apartment. It was a sound that reminded them both that normal people didn't live in fear of each other, that normal relationships didn't require walking on eggshells and anticipating violence. "They saved your life, you know," Marcus said quietly.
"If they hadn't intervened, I would have kept escalating. Eventually, I would have. I would have gone too far."
Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief. For the first time in 6 years, she felt safe in her own home. Not because Marcus had changed, but because she finally understood that there were people in the world who would protect her from him.
"Who are they?" she asked. "I don't know their whole story. But they're Navy SEALs. Special operations. They've probably done things overseas that would give us nightmares. And they decided that what I was doing to you was worth stopping." The weight of that statement settled over both of them. For men who'd seen the worst that humanity had to offer had heard Marcus's abuse and decided it was unacceptable. For men who'd faced down terrorists and enemy combatants had made it their mission to protect one abused wife in Virginia Beach. "I want to meet them," Sarah said suddenly. "I want to thank them." Marcus shook his head immediately. "No. That's not. They made it clear that their interest is in making sure you're safe. Getting involved beyond that might complicate things." What he didn't say was that he was terrified of what might happen if Sarah and the SEALs had a direct conversation. What if she told them things that made his abuse sound even worse than they already thought? What if they decided that psychological pressure wasn't enough? But Sarah was already planning. These men had given her something she hadn't had in 6 years, hope. They'd reminded her that she deserved protection, that abuse wasn't normal, that there were people in the world who would stand up for her. For the first time since her wedding day, Sarah Martinez began to believe that her life could be different. And it was all because 4 strangers had decided that she was worth protecting. The transformation was far from complete. Marcus's fear of the SEALs might have stopped his physical abuse, but it would take much more than fear to heal the damage he'd done to their marriage and to Sarah's spirit. But it was a start. And sometimes, a start is all you need to remember that endings are also possible. 6 months after the SEALs first knocked on Marcus Martinez's door, the transformation was complete in ways that no one could have predicted. The apartment building in Virginia Beach had become something of a legend in military circles, a place where warriors lived among civilians and proved that protection of the innocent didn't end when they came home from deployment. Sarah Martinez sat in apartment 2B, sharing coffee with 4 men who had become the most unlikely and important friends of her life. The woman who had once flinched at shadows now laughed easily, spoke confidently, and carried herself with a dignity that 6 years of abuse had never quite managed to break. "How's the new job working out?" Jake asked, refilling her coffee cup with the easy familiarity of an old friend. "I love it," Sarah said, and the joy in her voice was genuine. "The veterinary hospital downtown has been amazing. Dr. Peterson says I'm the best technician they've ever had, and they're paying for me to get my certification." It had been Bull who'd found her the job, using his network of veteran contacts to connect her with Dr. Peterson, a former Army medic who'd built a practice helping both military working dogs and civilian pets. The work was fulfilling in ways that her part-time job at the local clinic had never been, and the pay was enough for her to start building real independence. "And the apartment hunting?" Tommy asked. "I found a place," Sarah announced, smiling at the surprised expressions on all 4 faces. "A 1-bedroom in Norfolk, about 10 minutes from the hospital. I can move in next month." The SEALs exchanged glances. They'd been helping Sarah plan her exit from her marriage for months, but they'd assumed it would take longer for her to build up the financial resources and emotional strength to live independently. "That's fast," David said carefully. "Are you sure you're ready?" "I'm sure," Sarah said firmly. "Marcus started therapy like he promised, but we both know that our marriage is over." "Has been over for years, really. I just needed to remember that I deserved better before I could do anything about it." What she didn't mention was how much the SEALs' friendship had contributed to that remembering. Over the past 6 months, they'd shown her what respect looked like,
What protection felt like, what it meant to have someone care about her well-being without expecting anything in return. They'd reminded her that she was worth protecting, worth caring about, worth fighting for.
What about Marcus? Jake asked. How's he handling the separation? Sarah's expression grew more serious. Better than I expected, actually.
The therapy is helping him understand how badly he was broken.
He's not fighting the divorce. He's actually been apologetic. It was true.
The man who had terrorized her for 6 years had become someone she barely recognized. Marcus attended therapy twice a week, had stopped drinking entirely, and treated her with a careful politeness that suggested he was genuinely trying to atone for what he'd done. It was too little, too late to save their marriage, but it was enough to give Sarah hope that he might not hurt anyone else. "He asked me to give you guys a message," Sarah continued, looking at each of the seals in turn. "He wanted me to tell you that he knows he'll never deserve forgiveness for what he did to me, but he's grateful that you stopped him before he did something even worse." The 4 men nodded silently. They'd achieved their primary objective. Sarah was safe, Marcus was in treatment, and the cycle of abuse had been broken. But they'd also achieved something more important. They'd helped a good woman remember her own worth. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice taking on a different tone. "I want to start a support group.
For other women like me." Bull raised an eyebrow. "Other women like you?"
"Other military wives who are being abused. Other women married to men who think their service record gives them the right to hurt people at home." Sarah's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath it.
"I want to create a network.
A way for women to know that there are people who will help them, people who understand that being a veteran doesn't excuse being an abuser."
Tommy whistled low. "That's a big undertaking." "I know. But I've been thinking about it for months. How many other women are out there, living with men like Marcus was? How many of them think they have nowhere to go, no one who will believe them, no one who will stand up to their husbands?"
Jake leaned forward, his expression serious. "You'd need resources.
Funding. Legal support. Safe houses." "I know. And I think I know where to start." Sarah looked directly at him. "The military community that you talked about, the one that looks out for each other? I want to tap into that.
I want to create something where women can reach out for help and know that they'll be connected with people who have the skills and the willingness to protect them."
David shook his head in amazement.
6 months ago, you were afraid to speak above a whisper.
Now you're planning to take on domestic violence in the military community."
6 months ago, I thought I was alone, Sarah replied.
Now I know better.
And if I know better, I have a responsibility to help other women know better too. It was a transformation that went far beyond simply escaping an abusive marriage. Sarah had gone from victim to survivor to advocate, and the SEALs could see the determined activist she was becoming. "You'll have our support," Jake said quietly.
"Whatever you need."
"Network, funding, muscle, legal resources," Tommy added.
"Whatever it takes," Bull agreed. "Count us in," David finished.
Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude and determination rather than fear and pain. These men had saved her life in the most literal sense, but they'd also given her something to live for beyond mere survival. "There's one more thing," she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out an envelope.
"Marcus wanted me to give you this." Jake took the envelope cautiously.
Inside was a check made out to the Navy SEAL Foundation and a handwritten letter.
Jake read it aloud, to the men of Apartment 2B. "I know that you hate me, and you have every right to. I know that I don't deserve forgiveness from you or from Sarah. But I want you to know that your intervention saved 2 lives, Sarah's and mine. I was on a path that would have ended with me in prison and her in the ground. You stopped that from happening, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for that, even as I work to become the kind of man who never needed to be stopped. The check is a small gesture, but I wanted to contribute to an organization that trains men like you, men who protect innocent people from monsters like I was. Thank you for seeing Sarah's worth even when I couldn't." Thank you for stopping me before I destroyed both of us completely. Marcus Martinez. The apartment was quiet for a long moment after Jake finished reading. The letter represented something that rarely happened in cases of domestic violence: genuine remorse and accountability from the abuser. It didn't excuse what Marcus had done, but it suggested that the intervention had achieved something beyond just stopping the immediate violence. "He's really changed," Sarah said quietly. "I'll never trust him again, and I'll never forgive him completely. But I believe he's genuinely trying to become better." "Fear can be a powerful motivator for change," Bull observed. "Sometimes people need to be scared straight." "It wasn't just fear, though," Sarah said. "It was seeing himself through your eyes. Realizing that what he thought was normal behavior looked like terrorism to people who'd actually seen terrorists. That shook him in a way that nothing else could have." Tommy nodded. "Good. Maybe he'll think twice before he hurts anyone else." "Speaking of which," Jake said, "we should probably mention that we've had some conversations with other guys in the building about appropriate behavior toward women. Turns out Marcus wasn't the only one who needed an attitude adjustment." Sarah looked surprised. "Other guys?" "Nothing as serious as what Marcus was doing," David clarified quickly. "But there were some men in the building who thought that raising their voices and intimidating their partners was acceptable behavior." "We've been having educational conversations." "Educational conversations," Sarah repeated with a smile. "Is that what we're calling them?" "We prefer to think of it as community outreach," Bull said with a grin. "Building stronger, safer neighborhoods through improved communication and mutual respect. And the occasional demonstration of superior tactical capabilities," Tommy added. Sarah laughed, and the sound filled the apartment with warmth. It was a sound that the Seals had worked for months to hear, genuine joy from a woman who'd almost forgotten what it felt like. "You know," she said, "when I was growing up, my dad used to tell me that real heroes don't wear capes. They wear uniforms and carry weapons and show up when innocent people need protection. I never really understood what he meant until I met you guys." "We're not heroes," Jake said quietly. "We're just men who believe that some things are worth fighting for. Like innocent women who deserve to feel safe in their own homes," David added. "Like justice for people who can't get it through official channels," Tommy continued. "Like making sure that bullies learn that there are always bigger, scarier people watching," Bull finished. Sarah looked around the apartment at these four men who had become her salvation, her protection, and her friends. They'd given her back her life, her dignity, and her future. But, more than that, they'd reminded her that there were still good men in the world, men who would fight for what was right even when it wasn't easy or convenient. "I have one more favor to ask," she said. "Name it," Jake replied. "When I start the support group, when I start helping other women escape abusive situations, I want you to be part of it. Not just as backup or muscle, but as examples. I want women to know that there are men like you out there, men who believe that protecting women isn't just a job but a calling." The four Seals looked at each other and nodded slowly. "It would be an honor," Jake said. "And it would be. Because for these four warriors, the mission was never really over. There would always be innocent people who needed protection, always be bullies who needed to be stopped, always be women like Sarah who deserved to know that they weren't alone." 6 months ago, Marcus Martinez had laughed after hitting his wife, secure in the knowledge that no one was watching and no one cared enough to stop him. He'd been wrong on both counts, and that mistake had changed everything. Now Sarah was free, Marcus was getting the help he needed, and four Navy SEALs had added a new mission to their list, making sure that no woman in their area ever had to face abuse alone again. The laughter had stopped. The healing had begun. And justice, while delayed, had finally arrived.